Hunter, have you ever experienced jet lag?
The answer is yes. I've definitely experienced jet lag. I've experienced it on trips to Europe, but also on trips to Japan. And I'm always thinking, well, do I want to stay on my own time and be off hours where I'm visiting, or do I want to adjust to where I'm visiting and then be off when I get home? So that's kind of the internal monologue I have with time zones and jet lag.
Right. And I think most people who have done any sort of travel, even if you're just traveling internally within the United States, where we're located here, Hunter, I think most people have experienced this in some capacity where you're traveling and all of a sudden it's, an hour or two later, or if you're, for example, if you're going to Europe, it's now 9 hours later, and that's going to throw off sort of your natural sort of circadian rhythm that we all sort of have because we're, day night sort of species. And that's going to have these unintended effects of, well, I'm less tired or I'm more tired than I probably should be otherwise. And especially if you're traveling someplace like Europe, it's basically way off of the the day night cycle, the sun and no sun sort of cycle. And that can really sort of wreak havoc on how people are navigating throughout the new space that they're in. And so it's a very common side effect of traveling across our planet. And this is all done, Hunter, due to I guess, kind of invention called the time zone, which is not something that has been in place for a long period of time, as it turns out.
That and the airplane, which we talked a lot about last week.
Exactly. I mean, these are so the invention of airplanes and really railways, which we're going to get to in a little bit, sort of necessitated the need for establishing time zones, because now as people are traveling faster, it sort of gets harder to map out what time is it actually, as you're moving across these vast distances. And so why are we talking about time zones today? Well, I would say it's because time zones have a fascinating geography attached to them, really unlike anything else we've ever covered. I think, there's, population geography that makes, a certain more amount of sense. There's obviously political geography where, the world is carved up into borders and in lines now. And those are sort of the standard maps. There's climate and environmental geography, different climate types. These are all things that have sort of been mapped in very kind of like logical and natural ways. Time zones, they have a logic to them, but they are definitely different than anything else. It's kind of wild. If you've ever seen a time zone map, and of course, if you're watching on YouTube right now, there's one sitting in front of you. It is different.
It's kind of squiggly in places, right?
It gets very squiggly. It gets in some countries, and we're going to talk about this later in the episode, it gets downright wonky because the time zones kind of disappear and then reappear on the other side of the planet. It gets very weird. So we're going to talk about all that today. I also wanted to talk about time zones because I think in general, most people have some experience with time zones, even if somebody never travels. Let's say you're sitting in LA right now and you've never left the Pacific time zone. I would wager that at some point in your life, you've had a Zoom call at this point, a FaceTime call with somebody, across the country, and you're having to now navigate that time difference. So I think it's one of those things where it's like, at this point, there's no really escaping time zones and sort of the different times that people exist in relative to your own.
Well, sporting events, that comes into play as well. So if you're
sporting events,
if you're on the East Coast and, why is this game on so late? Well, it's being played on the West Coast and it's earlier there. So that's another way that people might experience time zones.
Yeah, I remember. So I have a friend in New York City. I'm a big Portland Timbers fan, and she is as well. And at one point they were playing New York City FC. But it was played here in Portland, and the Portland game was being broadcast, I think, at like 7:30 or 8 p.m. And of course, she was, kind of irate over that because, well, she had to stay up until 10 or 11 p.m. if she wanted to watch it, which meant staying up until, midnight or midnight-ish if, to see maybe the full version of that game or something like that. So all of that to say is, time zones spans media, spans travel, spans all these different things. And it is a very fun and interesting topic. So
let's get into it.
As usual, Hunter. Yeah, let's do it. As usual, we're going to start off with the history of time zones, how they came to be. I do think it's worth pointing out that sort of as we're talking about time and time zones, what we're kind of really starting to talk about, especially as it relates to history, is, well, how do we record and measure it? And I think this is something that we as a species, certainly living here in 2024, kind of take for granted that this was, having minutes, seconds, hours, and a clock to tell us what time it is, and a clock that's very accurately telling us, what time it is relative to a million other people, even living in our same time zone. I think this is something we sort of take for granted because this was definitely not the case even that long ago.
Yeah, we live in a society that's highly regulated by time as well. I mean, if you work, if you go to school, you've got places to be, you have to keep track of time. And sometimes you get to let go of that. Maybe it's on the weekend or maybe it's on vacation, but even then, you're really paying very close attention to time. So we've got it really well regulated, but it's kind of really intrinsic to the way many of us have to experience the world.
Yeah, I mean, this episode is really more geography as time. I mean, time zones is sort of the way that we can talk about it across geographies easiest, but we're talking about time a lot in this episode. And I do want to point out that, as I said, there wasn't this concept of seconds or minutes, even that long ago. I do want to, reframe this and say, of course, 1 second has always been 1 second. This
Right.
is right. It's not a like, time doesn't actually change. It's just sort of the method of counting it and sort of determining what that is. Maybe in a similar manner as, miles as compared to kilometers, right? Those distances have always existed and you can measure them in different ways, but that concept has always been there. 1 second has always been 1 second. We just haven't always measured it in that way. And so let's go back in time, Hunter, and talk about sort of the history of measuring time. Have you ever heard of a sundial?
I've certainly heard of the sundial. And
what is a sundial?
Well, it's this device that it's a flat disc and it's got something raised on it like a triangle. And you tell time by the way shadow is cast on it from the sun.
Exactly. I mean, that's almost exactly the way that I would describe it. It is typically, not always, typically a flat spherical device that has some sort of marker on it. Sometimes it is triangle. I've seen some that weren't always a triangle. But yeah, exactly. The shadow would cast on it, and that would be, it almost kind of look like a clock, right? It's kind of almost works in that exact same manner. Yeah. One of the issues being with a sundial is that depending on your geographic place within the world can sort of determine, well, I guess it's not going to ever be a standardized time, right? Because if you're farther north versus, let's say, the equator, the sun is physically in a different location with respects to you. And therefore, that's going to read out a different sort of time on your sundial.
And also the sun has to be out to use it.
And also the sun has to be out to use it, right? Yeah. There's no sundial, there's no shadow without the sun, or at least I guess you can artificially create it, but then you're not really telling time at all at that point. Some of the earliest sundials from archaeological record are these, they're also called shadow clocks, date to around 1500 BCE. And these have been sort of tracked through Egyptian and Babylonian astronomy. So both civilizations seem to have some form of these. There's also something called the water clock. Have you ever heard of this?
I'm not sure I know about the water clock.
I tried to do a little bit more research into understanding, and I couldn't see a video of how it worked. I have a little description here. It still seems a little bit, I'm not 100% sure how it works, I guess is what I'm going to say out there. I'm going to put that caveat out there. But apparently it was a timepiece by which time is measured by the regulated flow of liquid into, that's an inflow type, or out from, an outflow type, a vessel, and which then has sort of a time measurement attached to it. Again, this seems a little more complicated than what I was able to find. And unfortunately, we don't have an archaeological historian with us on today's episode. So we're going to kind of have to leave it at that. However, I can tell you that it was another common method of telling time, not just measuring time, but actually telling time. And it is kind of debatable, apparently, according to historians, on which is older, the sundial or the water clock. Apparently, they both came in around the same time. And so they don't actually know. There could very well have been some water clocks that predate sundials, which I think is kind of amazing.
The water clock sounds like a liquid version of an hourglass a little bit to me.
It does. However, it is different from my readings because it is a time telling device, and we're going to talk a little bit about the hourglass just very briefly here in a minute. But it is a time telling device and not a time measuring device, and
I
that
see.
is the point of
Okay.
clarification.
Oh yeah,
So
that's
the
that's
oldest,
a good distinction.
yeah, right. So the oldest water clock of which there is physical evidence dates to somewhere around 1417 to 1379 BCE during the reign of Amenhotep III, which was he was a pharaoh in ancient Egypt, and it was used in the temple of Amun Ra at Karnak. And so there are some historians that theorize Babylonians maybe had even older ones. So again, there's a lot of theories out there over which is which. And of course, Hunter, going back to your hourglass analogy, there are things like the hourglass devices or candle clocks, which are very old and have been used in some fashion. But these devices aren't. They're not really measuring. They're measuring sort of a countdown, right? They're measuring a period of time from X to Y. They're not really measuring the time as it exists throughout the day, and so that's sort of the difference here, and sort of why those don't really count in the same way as a clock does. And so that we're kind of just going to gloss over those and not really talk about them anymore. But that's kind of why they're broken out. And
I get
apparently the
distinction.
water clock,
Yep.
yeah, the water clock does sound very similar to an hourglass, but apparently it's more it's more aligned with a sundial actually telling time of day
Instead of measuring time. Yeah.
instead of measuring time. Yep. All of this is leading us to the way in which people understood time broadly, right? As people are starting to understand sort of what time is. Obviously, this is a concept that I think we as humans sort of take for granted today. But even understanding time, the flow of time, required a lot of philosophical conversation and thinking, but then also figuring out, well, what is this and how do we start measuring it? And of course, because we as humans have a natural circadian rhythm attuned to the day night cycle, we eventually get to this concept of local time. Hunter, what might local time mean?
Suppose local time is the time it is wherever you live, which would be different than somebody living someplace else, which will have their own local time.
Exactly. I mean, that's exactly what it is. Local time is where each locality had its own time adhered to their specific place as it relates to the sun, right? We're all humans. Now, obviously there are people, and there's probably people who listen to our podcast who, work the quote unquote graveyard shift where they, largely are awake at night and sleep during the day. Humans generally are not like that. That's not how we evolved. We evolved as a daytime species where we, are awake during the day, and that's when we do our hunting and fishing, what have you, sort of in prehistoric times. And then we would go to sleep at night. That was sort of our natural rhythm. And so, therefore, as people started understanding time and started to sort of grasp this concept of, well, what does it mean to measure time, and what does it mean to be, this period of time in this part of the day? Each locality would have its own time that was, attuned to their specific part in the sun, and therefore, a place in, for example, let's say London or ancient London, that would have a high noon time of day, the period of day when the sun is at its high point. If you go a few hundred miles to the east or west, the sun would not be at high noon during that time. And so the different high noons would be different depending on the locality.
I see.
And this, Hunter, this was generally fine. This worked for millennia, right? This didn't really have any material effect, because at this point in history, traveling from one point to another took a long time. And so if somebody did travel, let's say that those 500 miles east or west, they wouldn't really notice a difference in their circadian rhythm or local time, because the method of travel would take days or weeks. And so they would naturally attune themselves in a very slow fashion.
Well, there was no mass communication either, so you couldn't get on a
mass
phone
communication
or a Zoom call or anything like that. And sorry, it's the middle of the night for you. That wasn't a thing, because we didn't have that kind of technology for a long time.
Exactly. But then, Hunter, we started getting faster, and that's where things start to shift up. And this is where we move on to, we still have local time today. We can talk a little bit about that later. But this is where we get to something that's called railway time.
Okay.
And do you know what that might be?
I mean, is this the time that was come up to regulate schedules for rail travel?
Exactly. Right. So up until railways, again, it would take people a long time to get from point A to point B. Every place had a little bit of a slightly different time that was kind of attuned to high noon or their day night cycle. But once people started traveling by rail and you could move much faster, or freight was traveling by rail, this became an issue as trains would arrive to different parts of England where railway time was sort of first implemented. They would arrive to really who knows what time, because I mean, you might be able to measure, your minutes, your seconds, but traveling from, London to, let's say, Manchester, you might still be off by 10 or 15 minutes, depending on sort of what the local time is for that jurisdiction. And this would kind of wreak havoc on train schedules because, well, if a train departing from London says it's going to arrive at 9 a.m. and 9 a.m. in Manchester is, 30 minutes ahead of, London, then, well, when is that train actually arriving? Is it arriving on the London 9 a.m. or is it arriving on the Manchester 9 a.m.?
So adjustments need to be made.
Adjustments need to be made. And so railway time was instituted to standardize the time across geographies. In this specific instance in the United Kingdom, around August 23rd, 1852, time signals were first transmitted by telegraph from the Royal Observatory to various train stations, and that sort of standardized the process. And by 1855, 3 years later, 98% of Great Britain's public clocks were using Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, but it was not made the island's legal time until August 2nd, 1880. So the train stations standardized, that's what they were all using, but then it took another few decades for the country to adopt it more formally. Now, of course, this concept didn't mean too much in a place like England, where it was first implemented. Obviously, tracking the time across minutes and sort of making sure everybody was on, a standardized time, very important for schedules. But in the United States, we kind of get our very first, very rough time zones because the geography is much larger than the United Kingdom. There's actually a very fun map that shows some of these early time zones in the United States. We'll get to that in a minute. But first, we have to do our very first ad break.
Okay,
so
well,
we will be right back. And we're back. This is the Geography is Everything podcast. Today we're talking about the geography of time zones, or kind of geography of time more broadly. We just ran through a bunch of history, railway time, local time, sundials, all that kind of stuff. Now we're going to get to sort of the history of how we get to the time zones we know and love today, or maybe some of us don't love so much. So going back to the United States for a minute, we sort of left you on sort of this idea of railway time and how it was going to be applied to the United States. So timekeeping on 19th century North American railroads was a very complex affair. Each railroad at this point had its own standard time based on local time at its headquarters or key termini, leading to multiple times at some junctions, right? So a train from Union Pacific would roll into Chicago, and say BNSF, which is another big railway, it rolled into Chicago at the same time. They're both using times based on their wherever their terminus or wherever their headquarters are. And so they might be arriving at the exact same time with each other, but actually based on their own times, they're arriving at different times, if that makes any sort of sense at all.
I can see why they had to work out a different system.
Right. It's very wacky. A man named Cleveland Abe, who is the chief meteorologist at the United States Weather Bureau, proposed dividing the United States into 4 standard time zones in 1879 for weather station consistency. This would eventually be the material that would go on and influence the adoption of time zones. And so in 1883, 4 years later, influenced by Abe's work, the North American Railroad companies agreed to adopt a time zone system, which included borders running through major cities and rail stations. And there's a really fun map that's dated back to 1913, so a little bit after this, that shows it's called Standard Time Belts, and it shows some of these early time belts, and it's really fun to look at because they're kind of similar to what we have today, but they're also different in some key ways, such as places like Florida, most of Georgia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and Michigan being part of the central time zone. The eastern is sort of just almost the New England, mid-Atlantic region. Also, the Pacific time zone at the very southern border before it hits the bottom of California actually then juts over and extends all the way over to El Paso, Texas. So kind of wacky to
So, but
think about.
there were four of them.
But there were still four. There were still
Okay.
and they were still named the same. There were still the Pacific, Mountain, Central, and Eastern time belts,
So
not time zones, time belts.
that naming convention stuck around, but
The naming
but the
convention stuck around.
boundaries changed.
Yeah, there was another one, and so called. There was another time zone for U.S. and it was called intercolonial. And what could they be possibly talking about for intercolonial time zones, Hunter?
Well,
Think about during this time. This is like the late 1800s, even into the early 1900s.
I suppose that there's different territories controlled by different powers in North America.
Exactly.
Probably relates to that.
And specifically, they're talking like a large part about the Philippines at this point, because at this point, this was a colony of the United States. It was a colony from 1898 up to 1946, I believe. And so there needed to be its own time zone for places that were sort of in this Pacific area. And so they had the generic intercolonial sort of time belt name slapped on them. Apparently, within a year after so let me go back a little bit. So in 1883, influenced by his work, the North American rail companies, they adopted the time zone system. We already covered that. This system was inaugurated on the, quote, Day of Two Noons. That's November 18th, 1883, when railroad station clocks were reset as standard time noon. And this was reached within each time zone, as soon as it reached it within each time zone. The North American zones were named Intercolonial, Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. And within a year, 85% of cities with populations of over 10,000 were using this standard time, these standard time zones. The U.S. Congress formally adopted standard time zones with the Standard Time Act on March 19th, 1918. So a few decades after it was sort of initially proposed, similar as we saw in England, ending the confusion of multiple timekeeping practices in the country.
So these are the time zones that we have now, or we are not there yet?
They'll still get changed and adapted through the centuries, but these would be the ones that I sort of talked about earlier and sort of roughly starting to shape out to what we'll eventually end up with. But these would be the formal adoption of time zones as we know them today, right?
So,
you cross over a boundary and now it's an hour later.
In the world of trains, this dates back to the late 1800s, and it only dates back a little over 100 years in terms of being officially adopted in the United States. So this is a pretty recent thing.
It's a very recent thing. And so this is everything we've been talking about, at least, since the ad break, has been, the United States and sort of the railways. Globally, there's been people proposing some form of, time zone based system for about as long. So there was an Italian mathematician, Filippanti, who introduced the idea of a worldwide system of time zones in his book, Miranda, in 1858, suggesting 24 longitudinal days centered on Rome's meridian, plus a universal time for astronomy and telegraphy. But his system was initially ignored entirely. So people were like, nah, don't need it.
Oh, well.
Yeah. Sir Sandford Fleming, a Scottish-born Canadian, proposed a similar worldwide time zone system in 1876, dividing the world again into 24 zones, each covering 15 degrees of longitude with uniform time within the zones and hour differences between adjacent zones. So this is getting more similar to what we have today, right?
It sounds somewhat similar. It sounds like these were more mathematically even zones or something like that.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And what we can say is today's time zones are not necessarily adhering to a mathematical evening. And
right.
we'll talk a little bit about some of those in a little bit.
There's some interesting reasons for that.
Very interesting. Fleming's proposal received some consideration at the International Meridian Conference and influenced the concept of 24 time zones, though not directly adopted. And by 1900, most places used a standard time zone, but not all used an hourly GMT or UTC offset, which is, again, what we have today. By 1929, the majority of countries did adopt hourly offsets from GMT or UTC, with the exception of Iran, India, Myanmar, and parts of Australia using half-hour offsets, and Nepal adopting a unique 45-minute offset in 1986. And we're going to talk about Nepal again in a little bit.
Wow, okay. Yeah.
But Hunter, in all of this talk about imaginary time boundary lines, what have you, there's perhaps one that's more important than any of the others. What line might this be?
It's got to be the international date line.
It is absolutely the international date line. What is the international date line for our listeners?
It's an imaginary line that I believe is sort of in the middle-ish of the Pacific Ocean that demarcates one day from another on the planet. So if you cross it heading towards Asia from the United States, for example, you're going ahead in time. And if you go the other way, you go back in time.
It's a wild concept because, and we talked about this in one of our episodes, but if you fly to New Zealand from where we're here in the Pacific, so the west coast of the United States, New Zealand is really only, I think it's only about 4 or 5 hours behind us in sort of practical sense, right? So if it's 2 p.m. here, it's, say 9 a.m. in New Zealand. But that 9 a.m. is actually the day ahead of,
right.
which then like causes this sort of like mental, like, blackout almost. You're like, well, what? How does that even work?
So when there's New Year's Eve and you see footage, you might see footage from some small islands in the Pacific that get it first because they're on that side of the international date line, and then New Zealand, Australia, places in Asia, and then it comes to Hawaii is one of the last places to get it.
Totally. Yep. So the idea of the international dateline emerged from the need to unify global timekeeping practices and solve the problem of calendar days shifting as people moved across geography, longitudes, right? The establishment of the dateline was indirectly influenced by the International Meridian Conference held in Washington, D.C. in 1884. And although the conference primarily focused on selecting a prime meridian for international use, this would be eventually become Greenwich, England, it laid the groundwork for global time standardization, which included the concept of a date line. At this conference, the international dateline was placed at roughly 180 degrees longitude, directly opposite the Greenwich prime meridian. To give us a little bit of a callback to our antipodes episode, it would be the antipode of roughly the antipode of Greenwich Mean Time in Greenwich, England. If people are trying to locate them, you can probably just use London, and that's fine. That's probably a little bit easier for you to geolocate on a global level.
So it wasn't that, well, let's pick some place in the Pacific because there aren't a lot of people there. We have to base this off of where Greenwich Mean Time starts.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And people were proposing all different kinds of prime meridians, right? Greenwich just happened to be the one that got the most votes and sort of won and sort of became now it's called, I think people commonly see GMT, sort of scattered around. Right. Now I would say it's more common to see UTC, which is like Universal Time Coordinates or something like that. But yeah, and everything is sort of offset by that, right? So UTC, 0 is, right there in England. UTC, +1, that's over in, France, I think. I believe New York City is UTC -5, and we are UTC -8 because we're 8 hours behind the Greenwich Mean Time.
So this has to speak to the colonial imperial power of England, of the UK at the time.
Oh yeah, I mean it was based in Washington D.C. This International Meridian Conference was based in Washington D.C., but it was primarily, I think the other ones that we saw mentioned there was Rome being mentioned. I think Berlin was being mentioned as the home of the prime meridian. I think Washington, D.C. was proposed as well. There wasn't a lot of representation from South America or Africa or Asia at this conference saying, hey, maybe Beijing should be it, or hey, maybe Lagos in Nigeria should be it. That was not ever really a consideration, as I think probably would not come to a surprise by most of our listeners.
That's right, yeah.
But here's something interesting, Hunter. The international dateline was never officially adopted through any sort of single global agreement. There's nothing that codifies it, really.
Even today.
Even today. It's still, and we see this because its path evolves through other agreements, legislations, and international treaties sort of over time. The United Nations, as far as I could tell, does not regulate this. There's just nothing out there. So countries and territories near the line have adjusted their positions relative to the international dateline based on socioeconomic or political reasons. So I have a couple examples here. So Samoa and Tokelau in 2011, these territories shifted from the east to the west side of the international dateline in December of 2011 to align their week with major trading partners like New Zealand and Australia,
Wow.
effectively, nullifying that day gap, right?
They want to be on the early side of things instead of on the late side.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Similarly, Kiribati in 1995 moved the international dateline to include all of its territory on the same side, resulting in the easternmost islands moving from being the last to celebrate New Year's to some of the first. And so, again, if you're looking at an image of the international dateline, it's sort of, it's heads in, the same direction along the same meridian for a long time, and then does this very wide sort of, jutting out to the east. And that's Kiribati sort of saying, hey, we want all of our islands, makes sense. We want all of our islands to be on the same day. Kiribati, listener, if you're unfamiliar with it, is a large series of islands in the Pacific Ocean. It's a single country, but a large series of islands. And so today, the international dateline is recognized globally. There's no global agreement around it, but it is recognized globally as the demarcation line for calendar days. Again, though, it doesn't have any international legal status. And so
it's observed by most, but this is not like drawn out in any kind of agreement or anything.
No, and Kiribati changed their sort of where their islands were falling just unto themselves, and that didn't need to be ratified by the United Nations or anything like that. It sort of was.
Right, they got to choose, and everybody else had to conform by that because that's how they were doing it.
That's how they were doing it. Right. You land in somebody's territory, they're going to tell you what time it is based on their,
Right.
So with that, Hunter, let's go ahead and get to our current time zones. But before we do that, we have to hit our final ad break. And so we will be right back. And we are back. This is the Geography is Everything podcast. We're talking about time zones, a very fun, wacky geographic topic. We just ran through sort of how time zones sort of first came together, some of the early time zones, and even sort of the international dateline. I thought as we were sort of ending today's episode, it might be fun to talk about, well, one, what are our current time zones? And I think by doing that, we're going to talk about some of the wackier elements of time zones, because again, there's some, I would argue, geographic oddities floating around out there that don't make a whole lot of sense, but it is what it is.
Yeah, if you're looking at a map, there's some curious squiggles. There's some curious time zones there. It's not just this rationally sort of decided thing, but I guess different countries have different ways of thinking about how they want to have time zones exist in their own country.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll probably end today's episode by also talking about daylight savings, because it's coming up. So very top of mind, and also plays into a little bit of this time zone system.
I feel that this is become sort of a hot button issue in the last few years in particular, with a lot of people saying, why do we have this? Do we really need this? Let's do away with it. So I guess we'll get there.
Right. So let's first talk about China, because China, Hunter, has a very unusual, I would argue, circumstance. Now, if I were to ask you, in relation to the US, about how big is China?
It's similarly sized, maybe a little bigger is, what I would
exactly.
Suggest. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. It's almost the exact same size. Now, here in the United States, we have, well, let's just take the contiguous United States. Let's leave Hawaii and Alaska out of it and say, well, how many time zones do we have here? 4.
We
have 4. Right. Yeah. 4. We have the Pacific, Central, Mountain, and Eastern time zones. And so here in the Pacific, if we go to, in the Pacific time zone, if we travel to New York City or Philadelphia, we're going to jump 3 hours ahead. And that sort of all aligns, perfectly.
I suppose Alaska's got its own thing going on, perhaps.
Alaska is a little bit farther behind, as is. So, right. So if you go from, I believe, Alaska or Hawaii up to New York, you're jumping 6 hours ahead.
Okay.
But even just within the contiguous, right? It's still 3 hour gap, right?
Right.
China, again, similarly sized and kind of similar, like it's a very horizontal country like us, right? So it's spanning east west predominantly rather than north south. China is different because China does not have a it doesn't have multiple time zones. The entire country is on a single time.
So in
So
China, it's the same time everywhere in the country. Wherever you are, it's the same time.
exactly. So if you travel from Xinjiang over in the far west, sort of near Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, and you take a flight and you leave at 9 a.m. and it's let's say there's teleportation, right? Because let's take away the travel aspect of this. You teleport to Beijing, it's still 9 a.m. Now, the relativeness to the sun is going to be very different at that because
Right.
you're going through such a long distance, and so it's very interesting. I've never traveled obviously to Eastern China, but I imagine that the time must feel very different from what we're used to here.
Yeah, it's a very different situation, right? Because it's like you said, it's a distance long enough where we have four time zones.
Yeah.
And that it sounds like it's got to be some kind of moment of nationalism or national identity to just sort of adopt the same time zone for the entire country.
That's exactly what it was. So China uses a single time zone for the whole country, and the policy was adopted in 1949 to promote national unity.
Hmm.
And as a result, in Western China, sunrise and sunset times can be significantly out of sync with official Beijing time, which is sort of where they've centered their time,
Okay.
affecting daily life and business operations. So imagine, listener, if you're living on the West Coast and you wake up at say 5 a.m. and it looks like it's 8 a.m. out, based in sort of like New York or Washington D.C. That's kind of the same feel, and the inverse of that, of course, would be in the evening as well, right? So it's 2 p.m. Or 3 p.m. here. You would assume it still be very sunny and sort of afternoony, but it's actually feeling more like evening because that's what they've done. Very interesting. Up next, we do have Nepal. We sort of talked a little bit about this, and this Nepal, again, it's kind of a long country, but it's not super super big, so they can have a single time zone very kind of naturally. However, what they've done is they use a 45-minute offset from UTC, one of the very few countries to do so, and this is based on the longitude of its capital, Kathmandu.
So it suits the capital city, and so they do it this way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of the reasons that we're going to hit is just because it kind of suits their needs best, or it suited their needs at one point. And now it just kind of is the way it is. The Chatham Islands, this would be within the Pacific Ocean, sort of east of New Zealand. This is another place that also has a 45-minute offset, plus an additional hour during daylight savings time, which we're going to talk a little bit about later, making it one of the first inhabited places to see a brand new day.
Hmm.
Typically, as people talk about sort of the first places to celebrate New Year's Eve or something like that, they say places like New Zealand or Australia or something. But this is actually one of the very first places. There's one other place that's kind of interesting, and I don't actually have it here on my list, but there's a couple islands sort of in the Bering Strait, so between Alaska and Russia.
Right. Okay.
One's called Tomorrow Island, and one's called Yesterday Island. And it's because, and you can see them apparently from each other. And it's because if you were to go to the other island, you would be crossing the international date line.
Wow, that's super interesting.
Yeah. Again, another 45-minute offset. It's called Eucla and sort of surrounding areas in Australia. So this is southeastern corner of Western Australia. This would be a very local time, and it's unusual because it uses this 45-minute offset, not aligning with the standard time zones of Australia. And it was created to accommodate the needs of the local community and the Transcontinental Railway at the time, back in the I believe late 1800s, maybe early 1900s. I don't know when Australia's first transcontinental thing, but it's sort of, if you're looking at a map of Australia, there's basically three time zones. There's sort of the far west, which is sort of where Perth is. There's sort of the central time zone, which sort of encompass Adelaide and sort of I believe Darwin up in the north. And then you have sort of where Melbourne and Sydney and the island of Tasmania is in the east. This one would be technically the fourth time zone, and it is just a very small sliver on that south sort of coast, right at the edge of or bordering that central time zone of theirs. UTC 8 3/4 to be specific.
So interesting. Wow.
Yeah. It's fun. It's really fun. I time zones are wacky. Iran, it's probably the largest country physically that has an interesting offset time. So it encompasses the entire population of Iran, and they are offset by a half an hour. So it'd be UTC plus 3.5, 3.5, or during daylight savings time, 4.5. And it is one of the few countries that use a half hour time zone offset that also observes daylight savings time. So they're not only offset by an unusual time, half an hour, but they also will switch their clocks. And what we're going to find when we do talk about daylight savings time is not a lot of countries actually use daylight savings time. It's more of a Western sort of thing.
So most
Western,
countries don't get wrapped up in that.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Yep. Here's one that's interesting in kind of a similar way as China, but India is also on a single time zone unto itself. Again, we're talking about China. China has about 1.4 billion people, all on a single time zone. India also has about 1.4 billion people, all on a similar time zone. Now, if you look at China and India relative to their geographic positions, you can kind of see that India is sort of mostly, not all, but mostly sits south of China, right? At least the eastern China.
Right.
And that might make, yeah. And so that you might assume that they would be part of the same time zone. However, they are very much not because of China's wonkiness. If you are in northern India and you head across the border into China, sort of in the Tibetan area, you're immediately going to jump not 3 hours ahead, but you're going to jump 2.5 hours ahead because India also happens to be offset by a half an hour.
I see. So just crossing that line, it's 2.5 hours.
2.5 hours, yeah. It's very interesting. So you're like, I'm looking at this map right now as we're running through this. I have sort of my notes on one side and the map on the other. And if you look at the globe, starting in the Western hemisphere, sort of start scrolling your eyes to the right, you can see, okay, things are a little weird. There's some squiggles here and there, but things are generally pretty uniform as you sort of go from west to east, right? But then you hit sort of this China, South Asian area mostly, and the zones get real wacky. A large part of that because of China and how long it is, horizontal it is. But also it's just a lot of different municipalities want their own time zones, and they want their own times to be reflective of, I guess, their own specific needs. So everything gets a little wackier in that area. Going back to sort of some unusual sort of instances, there's Venezuela. And so this is the entire country of Venezuela. Apparently in 2007, Venezuela shifted from a UTC -4 to a UTC -4.5 to have more daylight during waking hours, though it did even more recently revert back to a UTC -4. So that's just an instance of a country. Again, countries can sort of mandate their own time, right?
So they tried it out, didn't like it, switched back.
Tried it out. Yeah, exactly. And they switched it back. So that would put them back on the same time zone as Western Brazil, Guyana, Bolivia, Chile, and Paraguay. Interestingly, all of Argentina, which is perhaps more closely aligned in a north-south manner with Venezuela, is on the same as Eastern Brazil. Mm-hmm. So maybe following more politically aligned or politically feasible needs, such as having Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo being on the same time zone. Maybe. The last one I have here for you, Hunter, is Newfoundland and Labrador in eastern Canada.
Okay.
And so what makes this one unusual is that, again, it uses a 30-minute offset from standard time, making it distinct from Canada's, and really North America is really the only place that has a sort of half-hour offset in one direction or the other. And I didn't dig too much into this, but a cursory research found that I couldn't find like a solid reason for this. It just sort of is what it is.
There's got to be a reason.
So let's end today's episode on sort of talking a little bit about daylight savings time, because that's sort of where we're heading, and I think it's consistently maligned, or maybe standard time is consistently maligned.
Yep.
Hunter, what is daylight savings time?
Daylight savings time is when you adjust the clock an hour so that there is more daylight. Is it in the winter?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah, there'd be more. Yeah, because you would want more daylight in the winter.
Right.
right? And there's a lot of theories on why this is. So daylight savings time involves advancing clocks by 1 hour during the warmer months to extend evening daylight, I guess.
Okay.
And so clocks are set forward in spring forward,
Right. All back.
and back in autumn, fall back to return to standard time,
So
resulting
standard
in
time
a
is the winter, and
standard
summer
time is the
is
winter.
daylight savings. Right. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, resulting in a 23-hour day in spring and a 25-hour day in autumn. Apparently, Benjamin Franklin in 1784 humorously, quote unquote, proposed waking up earlier in summer to save candles, marking perhaps an early conceptualization of daylight savings time. This I've seen this, floated around a little bit here and there. I couldn't actually find any sort of verification of that. It would be a person named George Hudson in 1895 and William Willett in 1907, who would each independently propose the concept of daylight savings time to extend daylight hours. But during that time, it still wasn't initially adopted. It would first be adopted as a time concept in Port Arthur, Ontario, Canada, now known as the city of Thunder Bay, in 1908. They would be the very first city to adopt it. In terms of sort of, bigger than a city, it would be the German Empire and Austria-Hungary who would be the first to implement it nationwide in 1916 in order to conserve coal use during World War I.
I see. Okay.
And so we start to see sort of this idea of, and we see a lot of sort of national policies sort of follow the same trajectory, where it's a matter of conservation during a particular period of time, be it war or, say famine or natural disaster, in order to conserve a resource, and therefore having to make sort of these big grand changes. And that's sort of what happened with the German Empire and Austria-Hungary during World War I. Since then, many countries have, at least Western countries, have adopted the use of daylight savings time. And this was particularly acute and happened en masse during the 1970s energy crisis. Hunter, remind us what that was.
So the energy crisis in the 1970s related to OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, controlling the amount of oil on the market, so there wasn't as much, and so prices went way up, and it was much more expensive to burn oil.
Exactly. And so I think I already mentioned this, but daylight savings time is not something that is widely used in the world. In fact, of the places in the world that use it, it's definitely a minority of the overall population. It's basically only North America as it relates to the United States and Canada. Haiti and Cuba also, and the Bahamas use it, but that's basically it in North America. And then European countries, and then a smattering of other countries, including Israel, Egypt, parts of Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and Paraguay. And that's basically it. Those are the only countries. So the vast majority of Africa and almost the entirety of Asia don't use it, at least not anymore. A lot of these places did formally use daylight savings time, but they no longer do anymore. There was sort of the need sort of passed. And I think what we see is during 1970s, during the energy crisis, a lot of the Western countries, United States, Canada, a lot of Western European countries adopted because they were the ones most impacted by the oil embargo at the time.
Right.
And so daylight savings time is typically not observed near the equator for the obvious reason that daylight variation is very minimal, right? You're kind of year round, you're getting about 12 hours of sunlight and 12 hours of nighttime.
There's no daylight to save. I mean, yeah.
Right. What are you going to do? Just going to jump ahead by an hour for fun? All states in the United States observe daylight savings time except for Hawaii and Arizona. Although this one's really interesting because I think this is, maybe very much highlights the aspect of time being a local affair. The Navajo Nation, which is within the borders of Arizona, does observe it.
I see. Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. Proponents argue daylight savings time increases daylight for leisure and can reduce energy use, though its overall impact on energy savings is widely disputed. So there's not really a lot of literature out there that says, yes, this works. Apparently, the myth that daylight savings time was implemented to benefit farmers is completely false.
I see.
In fact, according to what I could find, farmers have historically opposed daylight savings times due to its disruption of agricultural schedules. So apparently they sort of get the blame, and yet they're right there with everybody saying, no, we don't
We
want this
don't,
time shift
we don't
either.
need this. This doesn't help us.
We'll sort of end on this. So today, states in the United States can adopt standardized time as their one and only time if they wish. And that's what Arizona's on, right? They're on standard time. They're not on daylight savings time. But in order to adopt daylight savings time as their one and only time, they need congressional approval. And so in 2019, California, Oregon, and Washington all voted within their respective states and passed laws to permanently move each state to daylight savings time, but none have been able to implement it because
So
Congress has not.
it wouldn't be standard time. It's always going to be daylight savings time.
It would always be daylight
Okay.
savings time. Yeah. This year, apparently, from what I could tell, Oregon, where me and you are located here, Hunter, is considering to move permanently to standard time. So there is a distinct possibility that the switch for us happening in 2024 could very well be the last time we'd have to do this.
So are we going to do this with or without permission from Congress, or how does that work?
If Oregon switches to standard, they don't need permission. However, Oregon has said apparently that they'll only do it if California and Washington do it as well. And so the other two states have also said they'll only do it basically if the West Coast, because they don't. The idea being you don't want to travel, north across I-5, and especially here for those of us in Portland,
Right.
where our metro area is sort of split. If we travel up to Vancouver, Washington, to then be an hour ahead or behind, depending on sort of whatever wackiness is going on. And so they'll only implement that if all of them implement it.
Well, I guess we'll see.
I guess we will see. And with that is Geography is Time Zones. Hunter, run us through your whatnots.
Thanks. I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I am co-author of Portland as a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left City as a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, with David Banis as my co-author there. And I'm co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything.
Yeah, thanks, Hunter. My name is Jeff Gibson. You can find me over on YouTube. That's youtube.com/geography by Jeff. And you can watch more little fun videos about geography over there. If you liked what you heard today, you thought it was fun and engaging, you really enjoyed this conversation on time zones, please like and subscribe to us on YouTube. It really helps us out over there. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any other of the apps, please rate and review us. I love seeing those come in. People are always very highly complimentary, so that's really fun to see. If you want to follow us elsewhere, you can. We have a Substack. It's just geographyIsEverything.substack.com. Join us over there. Podcast lives over there as well. So if you want it sort of just blasted to your email once a week, you can do that. Let's see, Hunter, next week, what are we doing next week? I actually don't know.
I think I remember. I believe we are going to talk about, is it Alaska?
Well, let's see. No, it is St. Patrick's Day, actually, because St. Patrick's Day is coming up, and it's another one of our holiday episodes.
Okay, good. Yeah, so this will be an interesting one. A holiday that is closely associated with Ireland, but is probably celebrated with much more force in the United States.
Yeah. I mean, I think it'll be a really fun one. Our holiday ones are always very fun, so this one should probably be no difference. And I'm really interested in learning more about the history of St. Patrick's Day and how it spread sort of at least around the U.S. I mean, I guess it has a lot to do with Irish immigration, but we'll leave it at that, I think.
Yeah, we'll get into it.
All right. Thanks for listening. I guess we will see you next week for that discussion.